We are less than 48 hours. There's fewer than 48 hours left in the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. Evacuations are still underway. The White House says 2,900 people have been evacuated from Kabul in the last 24 hours. More than 114,000 have been evacuated since August 14th, and more than 120,000 in total have been evacuated since the end of July. The U.S. says it has received assurances from the Taliban that all foreign nationals and any Afghan citizen with a foreign visa will be allowed to leave even after Tuesday. For more on what's like on the ground in Afghanistan, joining us this morning is Halima Kazen-Stojanovic. She's a journalism professor at San Jose State, is from Afghanistan, and she spent more than a decade reporting there. Halima, thank you for speaking with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Ali.
You've been in touch with friends and family members still in Afghanistan. How are they describing to you the urgency of the situation there?
So it's very dangerous for some of the people that I have worked with in the past. People who have these have had public-facing work and research. There are professors, primarily political science, law, journalism professors at the public universities and at the private universities, and the hundreds of journalists that I have trained over the years. Their work has been public. Their critique of the Taliban is still in the open, and they're very vulnerable. And many of them have not worked with US or international organizations, so they don't qualify. They haven't qualified for the P2 special visa. And so we are desperately trying to get some very vulnerable people out. And this is through my work with the San Jose State University Human Rights Institute and UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center.
And tell us about some of that work, because as you mentioned, the people that you're trying to help are academics and professionals who maybe don't qualify for the traditional visa routes to get to the U.S. How difficult is it for them to gain entry to the U.S., and how can you and others watching help?
So the challenges are many, especially because how quickly, the government in Afghanistan fell and the Taliban regime took over. And I distinguish between a regime and a government, and I don't call the Taliban a government yet. And we'll see if that happens. So people I am in touch with and trying to evacuate, some don't have passports for their children, or if they have passports, they are expired. Some don't have visas to travel by ground now to any neighboring country, and those embassies and consulates are closed. And so you have a mix of families where some have passports, some have expired passports, have no passports, no visas. There are very limited options for ground travel because of Taliban checkpoints, and the borders most of the border crossings are closed. So it's desperation. The airport, you see those images, all eyes are on Kabul airport. It is a mess. The perimeter security has been left to the Taliban. Most people I'm working with are too afraid to go to the airport now. And once they go with the limited documents that they have, they are sure that they're going to be rejected. And so a lot of issues trying to evacuate people.
Have you spoken to some people who were in that situation you describe, who didn't have passports for their children or didn't have the proper documentation, who were still able to leave the country? Is there any sense that the U.S. service members or the State Department is giving some flexibility to people who need to leave the country?
So yes, some families who have been able to leave, they've had these mix of documentation situations, but usually the ones that have left have been supported by U.S. organizations applying them for P2 applications, which there are some flexibility, and others that have been supported by other governments. I know a family who's in Paris right now, who's the husband worked for the French embassy, was evacuated. Yes, they had limited documents, and they were the lucky ones that were able to get through those lines and get on. But that is probably 10% of the applicants or the cases or the people who are contacting me.
And you worked as a journalist in Afghanistan. You're from Afghanistan, worked there in news for more than a decade. Based on your experience covering the politics and the situation there, looking forward, What is the best case scenario for what we can expect for the nation of Afghanistan in the future?
So, as I said earlier, it's still a regime to me, and it wasn't a takeover. It was a coup. It was a coup that unfortunately was supported by the U.S. By the U.S. government, and still is. And there is a major disconnect between the Taliban representatives in Doha, which the United States has been negotiating, especially Afghan American envoy, U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad. There's a major disconnect from what they are reporting and claiming that the Taliban represent in what what is happening on the ground. And I'm talking to people every day in various provinces, not just Kabul, because there's a silence in the provinces, and that doesn't mean that there's calm and order. And there's a big disconnect between what the U.S. wants to represent that the Taliban is telling them in Doha and the commanders of the Taliban on the ground in Afghanistan. The scenarios are very different. There is much more distress and violence in the provinces, home searches, and so there seems to be friction in the Taliban regime. It is not a monolith. It has various structures and various groups that now I worry will compete for power and attention, not to mention some of the evidence that there is ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan in the area, which took responsibility for the airport bombings. However, I do think that this is also quite a bit of propaganda war, that the U.S. is building ISIS-K and blaming ISIS-K for the attacks. And so this is all very sensitive right now. We don't know what next week after the U.S. withdrawals will look like in Kabul.
A fast developing situation. Halima, really quick before you go, tell us about the scholarship for Afghan refugees that you have set up.
So we have a campaign, and now it's expanding to other universities. I started this with San Jose State University's Human Rights Institute and with Berkeley's Human Rights Center. Now UC Santa Cruz we've been able to bring on. We've placed people at Princeton, we've placed people at Drake. Now a lot of universities are joining to help us with the Afghan Scholars at Risk program, where we are trying to evacuate which is our primary concern, people who have public-facing work like professors and journalists, try to get them safely to another country, and then work through what we call scholar visas, J1 visas, and try to bring them to safety here in the United States. Also helping them pursue their work, their important work in documenting Afghan history, in the analysis, in the work that they do as professionals. They come here as refugees and as scholars, and we can still maintain their dignity in the work that they do.
Halima, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for filling us in. We are going to put a link to that fundraiser to help for those scholarships on our website. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insight this morning. You can go to KTVU.com under the web links section.
Thank you for having me.
All right.